Today I'm breaking down Tate McRae's It's Okay, I'm Okay. This track's built on punchy 808s, modern drums, and layered textures and synths that come together to build this explosive cinematic sound. So if you're wanting to bring that same level of intensity and emotion into your own tracks, we're going to break down each element so you can take those techniques and use them in your own productions. So let's get into it, but first, here's the example. Okay, so we're going to jump right in, starting with the drums. Here they are in solo. Starting with the kick, we've got a single sub kick here, and that sounds like this. We've got some really simple processing going on, taking out some of that kind of 500, boosting around 1K, a little bit of the low end out, and just a bit of a bump around the fundamental at around 75. And after that, what I've done is just group it, and we've got some processing on the top of that. So I've got some soft clipping first, that's pretty heavy, and just to show you what that looks like. So we're really clipping that kick to achieve that kind of loudness and just kind of rounding up those peaks. We've then got Ableton's drum bus. I've got the transient designer all the way up here just to really help it punch through. A lot of drive, a lot of crunch, but we've only got that just under 2 as far as the dry wet. And that's just to introduce a little bit in parallel. We don't want a whole heap going on there because of course we don't want to oversaturate the kick. So moving on from that, we go on to the snare or the clap in this case. And again, super basic. The drums in this are really quite simple. They're just really high quality sounds placed very well. So if we have a look at the clap here, this is what it sounds like. So that's a very simple 808 style clap. So I've gone ahead and added just a little bit of width to it, along with some smack attack, just to kind of emphasize that transient in parallel. Then we've got soothe, just to really suppress those frequencies that are kind of getting in the way of the rest of the mix. And that's about it for the clap, just really clean and simple. So moving on to the percussions, there's actually a really sort of crucial loop type of thing here. I've gone ahead and basically just placed individual sort of one-shots to make the groove myself. And basically that's just a combination of triangle samples. So it sounds like this. And so you can kind of hear this faintly in the background of the original. I've tried to keep it as close as I could to the original, of course, but might be slightly different. But just to show you the sort of general processing on that, a little bit of compression just to keep everything kind of at the same level, all of the different one-shots. Then we've got auto pan, which is basically flipping it from either side of the stereo field. So if you listen carefully, you can really kind of hear it shifting from side to side. After that, we've got a little bit of EQ, just sort of getting rid of all of the lows up to pretty much where those triangles are hitting on the frequency spectrum. I wouldn't normally advise sweeping that far, but in this case, it was just kind of the safer option just to have only those tops because it's so faint in the background. Right after that, we've got RC20, and this is just adding a little bit of distortion, a little bit of dirt to it, because they ended up a little bit too thin. So just added a little bit of that. And then just taking off some of that harsh high end with a basic EQ. So right underneath that, I went ahead and added just a little hat loop just to give the whole sort of drum track a little bit more stability. So that sounds like this. Just a very basic EQ, not doing a whole heap, taking off some of the high end, and really just getting rid of some of those lows. So in the second section, you actually start to hear these faster hats, almost like a trap hat. They sound like this. Definitely not as nice in solo, but of course, there was a reason I processed them like this, and it was really just to kind of help them sit a little fuller in the mix because they tend to sound a little bit thin sometimes, just to my ears anyway. So I really wanted to kind of thicken them up a little bit, give them a little bit of those kind of high mids, and just sort of give it some of that noise just to fill out the drum sound a little bit. And that's a really cool thing that you can do, whether it's with an ambience or using something like RC20 on your hat. So the processing that I did, this is the original sample. And basically all I did was a very sort of wide bandpass type of thing here, taking out some of those lows and some of the highs, then using Soothe just to get rid of some of that harshness. And on RC20, I've used the Drum Break 3 preset and played around with the settings, I believe. There's a bit of distortion on here. Put the follow all the way up, and what this basically does, any of that kind of vinyl noise or whatever noise I've chosen, yep, the vinyl one here, basically it follows the hat. So every time the hat plays, the vinyl will play and then it'll stop as soon as the hat stops. So It's a really nice way to add thickness to something without kind of destroying it completely or crowding up other elements. So after that, we've got the distortion and we've got a little bit of space, a little bit of reverb, basically just sort of moderate tail here. It's not doing anything too drastic, but it's really nice to have some space on your hat sometimes. And so right after that, just to add a little bit of groove, I often like putting something like LFO tool on my hats just because it helps them bounce just that little bit more. So this is what it sounds like without it. To me, it's just a little bit static, and I think that it could just kind of have a little bit more bounce to it. So what I did was add this LFO tool, and this is the sound that we get. It just kind of emphasizes that upbeat a little bit more, and I think that that can do a lot for a track if you feel that it's sounding a little bit stale with sort of straight 16ths. So right after that, we then put kickstart, but that is directly linked to my kick. So the kick, every time the kick hits, the hats are going to duck. But even then, I've put the mix at 75% just so it doesn't kind of duck them out too much. It just does it that little bit. It suppresses it slightly whenever that kick hits. It just cleans up the low end of that kick and just helps it sit better in the mix overall. It's not something too noticeable. I don't do it so much for effect, but more as a mix technique. So right underneath that, we've got an open hat. And again, we've used more or less the same processing as far as RC20. We've added, again, that follow with the vinyl, drum break 3 with the tube and a little bit of reverb. So I'm pretty sure it's the same. Yeah, exactly the same preset. And just taken, again, some of those lows out at the beginning and then used standard clip just to really squash it and kind of round out those peaks. And again, it just helped me kind of raise the volume and allowed it to sit better with the other elements. So altogether, just so you can hear the drums one more time, this is what they sound like. And then the second section. So as far as the drum group, we've got a bit of processing going on here. I've got some EQ, just lifting that high end and boosting the low a little bit, taking a touch of that low end out up to around 21. A little bit of drum bus with just a touch of drive and crunch. We've upped the transients just a little bit, just so it has some of that punch overall rather than kind of destroying the whole mix. And again, this is just in parallel, only 15%, so it's super subtle, and it's been followed by a soft clipper. This is T-Rack's classic clipper. Love this plugin. We're boosting around 8.2, taking away 8.3. We could probably gain stage that a little bit better, but kind of sounded good at the time. And of course, we've got the slope further to the left. Now, if you bring it further to the right, you'll kind of hear a bit more of that snap in the drums, which can work for, I think, maybe more of the kind of dance stuff or more of that kind of disco vibe where you're just trying to get sort of straight drums, just really punchy, standing out in the mix. With more hip hop stuff where the low end sort of needs to be a little more rounded, I find that shifting that to the left, rounding out that kind of curve is just much better and just sounds better to my ears, at least for a mix like this. And lastly, we followed that up with just a little bit of parallel compression. So next up, we've got the 808 and respace. This is what they sound like in solo. So there are three things going on here. We've got the 808 that's playing the kind of simple line. We've got a respace underneath that. And then we've got that little 808 lick at the end, and it sort of plays a bit of a run, and we're using sort of pitch bending and things like that. So I'll run you through all three, starting with the simple 808, which sounds like this. And basically that's just a preset in Serum from a really great pack that's actually free called 808 Day version 3 by Echo Soundworks. You should definitely try it out if you're in need of some really sort of good 808s. This is the Chaos preset. It works for a lot of tracks in this style, so I highly recommend it. And as far as the processing, we've got quite a bit of EQ going on here, and what that's doing, taking out some of the lows, as well as some of the highs, and we're using dynamic EQ to get it out of the way of the kick. So that's been linked up to the kick through here. We've hooked it up to our kick called this one, and it's basically dropping the fundamental frequency from the kick inside that bass. So processing like that really creates a lot of space. And when you get the hang of this technique, it really works wonders for your track. So definitely try and start implementing dynamic EQ and sort of using it to sort of help certain elements sit better with others. So right after the EQ, we've got just the stock Ableton saturator, nothing special here. and we're just boosting the drive on that, and it's in parallel, so it's just below halfway, and just compensated for the volume a little bit with the output knob. We've also put a little bit of soft clipping on it just with the stock standard on and off button on the plugin. After that, taking out a little bit of the low end. We're using a little bit of Pro MB here, and then some limiting at the end. So while we're on the 808s, I'll show you the run at the very end. That sounds like this. So what we're doing here is pretty simple. I always find that you have to listen a few times to really kind of get what's happening in sort of runs like this, but it's really quite simple when you break it down. So in Ableton, if we just double click the region and we go to this section here, make sure we're on MIDI control and pitch bend, and that gives us the option to pitch bend certain notes, which is really cool. And so what we've done is go first note, second note, halfway through, that's where we bend down, and we're going down 12 semitones. So I'll show you how to fix that in a second, but basically what we're doing halfway through that note, all the way down, and then to the last two notes. And it's really important that when you're bending these notes that you start after the note has begun, so after the initial transient, but also before the very next note. So that's really important because it'll just make it sound that much cleaner. So the best way to control how far up or down the slide actually goes, you want to have a look at Serum, and this will usually be present in most synths like this. You'll see a section for the bend range, and it's usually around the kind of pitch wheel, and we've got that up 12 and down 12. So that means that if we pitch all the way up, it's going to go only as far as 12 semitones. And if we pitch all the way down, it's only going to go as far as -12 semitones. So initially, a lot of those will be set to -2, +2, but you just want to basically change those so you have a wider range when you're pitch bending. And again, we've pretty much done the same processing. I ended up using a different preset within the same pack because it just had a slightly better kick transient to it, and it sounded better than when I was sort of linking my kick up with it. So that's something to consider as well. Whenever you're doing bass runs and things, you got to make sure that the kick sounds nice with it and it's giving the same level of punch on every note. That sounds good without sort of sounding too, I guess, invasive with a massive kick. So I've chosen to use sort of a bigger kick in this sort of remake, but the negative side to that is that when you start doing runs and things and you kind of sort of start doing multiple notes in a row, it might not sound as smooth. So you want to find something that has a nice kick transient to it that you can at least just use for those runs. Otherwise, I'd probably recommend just having something that's really cohesive the whole way through. And just when you make those runs, it'll just be a lot smoother. So what I did was just find another preset. This one's called TikTok. It just had a slightly nicer kick transient for this particular run, and that worked really well. So directly underneath the bass the whole way through, I've got this respace, and that sounds like this. So this is just a really basic respace. The processing we've got on here, some sort of minimal EQ. We have taken out a lot of that mid-range and a lot of sort of around the initial fundamental area to get out of the way of the kick, but also out of the way of the initial 808, which we really want to kind of make the main focus. This is really just to support that sound and to just give it a sort of foundation or some kind of atmosphere underneath it. So it's not just a dry 808. And right after that, we've got Ozone Imager. We're basically widening the whole thing with a little bit of the stereo wise. And because there's so little low end in it and we've removed the fundamental from Serum, it just sits much better in the mix and doesn't kind of compete with the main 808. So that worked really nicely and it sits really well. And for the second section, we've actually got this 808, which just is a little bit fuzzier and just gives it that kind of texture when that second section comes in, just so it's a lot bigger. And it sounds like this. So it's really thin, but once we get to those really, really low notes, it's not much of an issue because there's not any of those lower frequencies hanging around and struggling to reach those lower notes. It's actually works really nicely. It gives us the illusion of that really, really deep sound. But because it's so thin, it just sits along the top and complements the other two basses. So it's more texture that we're adding here rather than a third bass. We've crushed that a little bit with soft clipping. Again, that's just kind of thinning it out a little bit and compressing it that little bit more, rounding out the peaks rather. And then we've got Soothe 2 just to sort of suppress some of that harshness in the top end and just a little bit of limiting to sort of tame that volume just in case. But it's also giving us a little bit of volume as well. So that's all three basses. And on the group, we've got Kickstart 2. Again, we're just sort of really getting it out of the way of that kick. And you can see the kick here if we have a look in the whole mix. So we've used this line here. So we've basically brought it all the way up to the kick waveform, and we've left a lot of that top end and even those kind of lower mids. We're just sort of letting that pass through because it wasn't really hurting anything. If anything, it was adding to the atmosphere, just sort of having that sort of riding across the top. What we're really worried about are those really super lows, getting in the way of the kick, getting in the way of a whole bunch of other things, disrupting the headroom. We really want to tame that. But, you know, as far as some of those higher frequencies, some of those mids, they're okay if they're kind of not disrupting anything. So that's what we've done here. I may even take it up a little bit further if I were to revise this, but otherwise it seems to be working fine for now. And after that, we've just got a bit of limiting. Again, something I just like the sound of. It kind of tames those transients a little bit, which limiters can do, and just gives us a little bit of volume, and of course just maintaining those levels. And one last thing, we've got just a little bit of parallel compression, and I'll show you what that looks like. You can copy the settings here. Of course, make sure you level match just so you're not simply adding volume. You want to make sure that you're actually hearing that compression and you're hearing that energy in the parallel compression. So moving on to synths. Before we get into this, there's actually a lot going on as far as vocals in the actual backing track. So there's a lot of kind of strung out vowels and things like that that just really fill it out a lot. So to compensate for that, I just kind of started with a pad. It sounds like this. A super basic pad, and I've used the Juno 106. It has some amazing presets built in, and it's really easy to adjust those presets as well, which I always recommend doing just to tailor it to your track. And I remember an A&R telling me years ago that you really can't go wrong with classic sounds, and you've already heard plenty of those in this track. You've heard the 808 clap, we've got this, and in a lot of modern productions, especially in the electronic stuff, there's more of that vintage stuff than people realize. So definitely don't disregard some of the vintage stuff. It'll often work in many cases. So definitely check that out. Juno, I'm a massive fan of. The second layer here, this is more the second section, but this is really what kind of gives it that cinematic feel. So right after it drops into that second section, we come in with these little thirds up the top. And what I've done is layered them with some other serum sounds. So check this out here. And so that just makes it sound that much bigger. So if we have a look at the sounds that I've actually added in with Serum, you can really hear that there's a massive reverb on that sound already. And it just adds to that space, adds to the atmosphere. And I haven't done a whole heap to process them. It's really just about where you place them in the mix. So this is 25 to the right, and then the second sound is 25 to the left, and that sounds like this. So it's more of a vocal chop, but again, just it complements that other sound really nicely. It's a little on those higher frequencies. It's got that sort of breathier texture, and little single shot sounds like this that aren't necessarily plucks can be a really great way to add that life to your tracks. So we're sort of working backwards here for the synth section, but if we have a look at the first section, we've actually got the plucks that run more or less throughout the whole song. So I've got a little bit of room reverb on that. It's probably not the exact sound, but I sort of found something that sounded similar and just sort of carved it out a little bit. I think I just played around with the ADSR, and really taking up this high end was what kind of got rid of the otherwise kind of plasticky kind of sound it had, and just kind of mellowed it out a little bit and really helped it sit in the mix. So after that, we've got a little bit of kickstart. Again, just reducing the mix to 60% and some soothe. So in the second section, we've actually got the exact same thing, and it's just the lower octave. It's a little bit louder in this case. I'd probably lower it just a little bit so you can hear that higher one a little bit more, but it seems to be working okay for now. Now to complement those plucks, it's actually really cool what's going on here. I had to listen pretty carefully, but what you can actually hear is this little, a sort of pluck slash pad that has a little bit of rhythm to it. So it sounds like this. And in isolation, sounds like this. It might not be exact, but it's something like that just sort of going on in the background. And what's really cool about that is that it's kind of playing the role of a pad, but it just has a little bit more of that groove. And that can be a great way just to add interest and movement to your track without just sort of laying down a static pad. So right underneath that, I just added a little bit of piano just to kind of help it stick out a little bit more. And again, we've panned these left and right, 25 and 25. And so here are all those sounds together. And so next up, we actually have some vocal chops. Now, of course, they chopped up Tate's vocal, but it doesn't mean that you can't find sort of similar vocals and chop those up as well. So I'll show you what I did here. I found just a very random vocal chop. It doesn't sound exactly like Tate McRae, but it's something that just kind of fills that space and adds to that atmosphere. So this is what they sound like. And so without any of this processing, it sounds like this. I think they're actually all the same sample, so I just went in and pitched them individually. Right after that, I added a little bit of Avox Throat. This is an amazing plugin. It basically changes the kind of makeup of the throat to really transform the voice. You can add a little bit of breath. You can model the throat. If you just play around with a lot of what's going on, you'll just sort of hear the different tonal changes. It's really cool. I've just added a little bit of breath, which I thought gave it a little bit more life. Taken out some of the lows, compressed it just a little bit, used CLA effects just for the reverb, a dotted eighth delay, and some chorus. We've actually taken out a frequency that was clashing with the snare because, of course, it's hitting at the same time. So again, just be mindful of those things. You can use something like dynamic EQ to alleviate those problems, and that really helped the track out here. And then just Pro R just for that extra bit of space. So directly after that, we've actually got a little bit of a break just before that next section hits, and it's basically one beat of silence except for this sound. It sounds like this. It's just a random sample that I found when I typed in woo, and it pretty much came up processed. I just added a little bit of compression. And so in context, this is what both of those things sound like. I'll just sort of play it from halfway. There's something like that little vocal sample that just adds so much. There's nothing going on behind it. It's just one little sample, but it has so much impact when it's sort of played in isolation and in contrast to the sort of bigger parts of that track. It just really makes that second section sound much bigger than it probably is because it has that break. So whenever you've got a section that you want to sound huge, like a drop or something like that, whatever's coming before that, just try and make that smaller in some way, and the next section will sound massive. So moving on to the last element, which are the effects. They sound like this. So three things going on here. We've just got a very small reverse cymbal here. Then a downlifter, just whitewash. I use that one a lot. Then right after that, we've got another downlifter that's sort of imitating a breath. And those three together sound like this. And so that's more or less all of the instrumentation. So if we have a quick look at the master, we're taking up the very lowest frequencies that we can't perceive, bumping some of that low end around where the kick fundamental is, taking out some of the lows from the side, so using some mid-side EQ here, and just notching out with dynamic EQ around 256, which is usually a bit of a boxy kind of frequency around that area, around 200 to 300. Next, we got a little bit of compression, followed by some soft clipping. We're using Soothe 2, a preset that I use a lot, mastered by Goodwin 2. It just really rounds out those lows nicely, along with that very top end. Then we've got Ozone Imager, just to really kind of carve out the imaging at the end. I like to just really narrow those lows, as well as give the mids a little bit of width. I'll sort of go back and forth on this one, but the very, very highs, I'll sometimes either widen a little bit, particularly if it's a preset, I'll just kind of leave it if it sounds good. But oftentimes, if I've got those really, really high frequencies, I'll kind of bring them in a little narrower, because I find that that just kind of tightens the track up overall. So you can have a play around with that and just sort of see what works best for your tracks. And then we've used the stereoize a little bit, just to kind of give it that little bit extra. And lastly, we've got T-Rex 5. using some of the limiting here, reaching around 3 dB of gain reduction. And as far as volume integrated LUFS, we're hitting around, I believe, 9.5. We'll just check that. So around 9.6, 9.7. I think that's a really good place to aim, especially if you're sort of handing in demos and things like that. It's a good amount of loudness. If you're around kind of -12 to 14, it can sometimes feel a little bit soft. So I recommend, especially if you're handing into like a label or something like that, if you can get it a little bit on the louder side, it's not going to compensate for a bad song or a bad production. It's just that extra little thing you can do to just kind of make it sound that little bit more radio ready. And so once again, here's the track in its entirety. So that's Tate McRae's It's Okay, I'm Okay. If you found this breakdown helpful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know in the comments which track you want me to break down next. Until then, go make something massive. See you in the next one.